This is one of the back paws of the famous Sphinx on the Giza Plateau. And the story of its age has been controversial for a long time, but we have geological evidence, as in geologists' professional opinions, about when the initial carving would have been done. So what you're looking at behind me, of course, is the erosion. This is limestone, probably an ancient seabed. And the erosion, you would think, would have been the result of wind, blowing sand over the course of, say, a few thousand years to do that. But Dr. Robert Schoch of Boston University, who is an expert on the weathering of stone, has stated for many years that this is the result of precipitation. This weathering is from water. So, as you can see, it's a desert now, but 8,000 to 10,000 years ago, it was savanna, it was grasslands, maybe even tropical. So this weathering means that this was actually carved out, that this work was done at least 8,000 to 10,000 years ago, and that dates the Sphinx at being 8,000 to 10,000 years old. Several thousand years older than the dynastic pharaonic culture of Egypt. As you can see, the weathering on the body is much greater than the weathering on the head. And basically, only the head has been exposed for any significant amount of time. Usually the body has been covered in sand. So how can you explain that the body is more heavily eroded than the head is? And really the only logical explanation for that is the fact that the head has been recarved at least once, if not many times, because the proportions are way off. The body of the Sphinx, including the tail, the feet, and the torso, etc., are in reasonably good proportion with one another, but the head is much, much smaller. So based on scientific evidence of Dr. Robert Schoch and supposedly at least 200 other geologists from around the world, the weathering of the Sphinx and the weathering of the Sphinx enclosure is the result of water weathering, and that could only have happened at least 8,000, maybe 10,000 years ago. And that dates the Sphinx at that age, because the Sphinx had to be cut out down into and open up to create this enclosure. It wasn't, as you can see, the Sphinx is not on the level normal ground, it's sunken down. And so these walls here, all of this was carved out in order to shape the Sphinx as we see it. And the other intriguing thing is that the Sphinx Temple, which is in front of the Sphinx, is what is composed, or where the stone from this area was used. And those stones are megalithic, multi-ton. So the people didn't simply carve the Sphinx out with primitive tools. They cut multi-ton blocks out, moved it or them all to the front, and created, supposedly, the Sphinx Temple from that. That is a major engineering achievement, not something that a Bronze Age culture such as the dynastic Egyptians probably were capable of.
But we realized that the Egyptians had brought megalithic pieces of limestone weighing more than 20 tons. This is the miracle, because in modern time we can't find such huge pieces. Yes, we have so many quarries of limestone, but to find big blocks like this and to manage to cut this megalithic piece nowadays, I think it is impossible. Maybe in granite, yes, we can do this, but in limestone, no, because limestone in the quarries, we can cut blocks like 5 tons maximum, okay, or 2 tons or 3 tons, but more than 20 tons, this is impossible, in my opinion.
So, to encapsulate what has been said, as I walk past the tail of the Sphinx here, the body of the Sphinx was dug out of the bedrock. Only the head was exposed. Geologically, that's called a yardang. It was originally just a knob above the ground. But the carving of the Sphinx's body wasn't simply done by chipping away into the bedrock. Multi-ton blocks, and what Mohammed said, at least, or possibly as big as 20 tons, were removed, and the Sphinx Temple was created from those blocks. And based on the weathering and erosion of the walls here, that was done by water, not by wind and sand. And the only time that could have happened where there would have been so much rain to erode the bedrock would have been at least 8,000 years ago. Now, as far back as the dynastic Egyptians go, the first dynastic Egyptian was believed to be a ruler about 3100, maybe 3200 BC. So we're talking roughly 5,000 years. So at a minimum, the Sphinx is 3,000 years older than the Egyptians. And therefore the question is, who made it? And who removed the multi-ton blocks to create the Sphinx Temple? One answer is that they were called the Cometians. And for more information about that subject, please look up www.chemitology.com. So what Yusuf Awiyan just pointed out is that the Sphinx Temple, which is in front of the Sphinx, and the Valley Temple, which is to the right of its head, actually most likely were contemporary. The Sphinx Temple looks much more eroded than the Valley Temple, but the Sphinx Temple was much more, how shall we put this in a nice way, recycled as compared to the Valley Temple. The Valley Temple still has its mega tonnage blocks of engineered granite standing in sockets in the ground, but all of those were taken out of the Sphinx Temple and recycled to make statues, other parts of buildings. And the thing is, it's not simply that that would have been done, say, by the Greeks or the Romans. It may have been done even farther back in time than that. Interesting graffiti-covered stone wall. How about the fact that you're actually looking at the Great Sphinx of Egypt? What we now know, thanks to the work of Dr. Robert Schoch, John Anthony West, Graham Hancock, and others, is the fact that the Sphinx has been shown to be older than any pharaoh, at least 2,000 or 3,000 years older than the first known pharaoh. So we're looking at a pre-dynastic, pre-pharaonic construction. This, of course, is repair work. And the Sphinx has been repaired over and over and over again. It's even been written that the Sphinx was being repaired during the time of Khufu and Khafre, the pharaohs supposedly responsible for the giant pyramids behind the Sphinx. But water erosion, as based on the work of Dr. Robert Schoch, as shown here in the Sphinx enclosure, it's water erosion that caused the necessity to repair the Sphinx. The head is not original. It was recarved at least once. And what most people don't know is that the Sphinx was originally simply the head exposed above the plane of sandstone. It was dug out to create the shape of the body. But it wasn't dug out with a bunch of adzes, shovels, and chisels. Cubes were taken out. Giant cubes, which wound up being converted into the Sphinx Temple and possibly also the Valley Temple nearby.
Okay, we're now going to discuss the erosion on the Sphinx, and we have to give credit to the great Dr. Robert Schoch from Boston University, who first was brought here by John Anthony West in the early 90s, and did a detailed study of the erosion of the Sphinx. It was featured in this NBC special, Mysteries of the Sphinx, which was nominated for 2 Emmys and won an Emmy for Best Original Screenplay. As Dr. Schoch explains, limestone is sedimentary rock, forms in sediments under the ocean. It's called nummulitic limestone. It has little seashells, nummullites. So it does not form uniform. Limestone falls heterogeneous, not homogeneous, meaning you could have a hard layer, soft layer, harder layer, soft layer, harder layer, hard layers, harder layer. So what he found is the particular erosion that we see here, some of the hardest layers. He actually mapped the whole stratigraphy of this side, each layer, and its hardness and its durability. So what he found was some of the hardest layers of deposition are the most eroded. So he concluded that it would take rainfall beating at an angle for thousands of years to do this. Not a flash flood, not a flash rainfall. It takes steady rainfall for thousands and thousands of years. The hardest erosion layers are eroded. And it has this. The erosion in the front of the Sphinx was 8 feet deep. The erosion layer in the back of the Sphinx was 4 feet deep. Not all constructed at the same time. First was the head and the forelegs, then the body and the tail much, much later, thousands of years later. So she's not done it all at the same time, but that obviously the head was done first. And also he concluded that the top layer that you can see was actually the ground level of the plateau.